We start with breaking news in Washington as President Trump lashes out at the Supreme Court for striking down his sweeping tariffs. The High Court ruled 6-3 that the president does not have the authority to impose tariffs under the emergency powers law he used to do so. Trump promised to impose new duties through other avenues, and he called the decision deeply disappointing.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing. And I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
Let's bring in CBS News White House reporter Aaron Navarro. Aaron, can you break down the response from the president and what stood out to you from what he had to say?
Mugo, good to be with you. I want to start with his language about the Supreme Court justices, where he did praise the 3 conservative justices who dissented, but had a lot of harsh language for the majority of the court that voted against his tariffs. He called them, quote, unpatriotic, disloyal, lapdogs for rhinos, Republicans in name only. He also was asked about Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, who you're seeing on their screen, voted in the majority, and whether he regrets appointing them, as he did in his first term. He said he did not, but he said, quote, I think it's an embarrassment to their families if you want to know the truth. He also repeatedly suggested that foreign influence was a factor in the decision of the majority in this court ruling, though he did not give any specific evidence, and said that the justices who voted in the majority are, quote, barely invited to his State of the Union address. The other big thing that we saw from him earlier this afternoon in the White House briefing room is the alternatives that he is now going to implement or has already implemented to replace the tariffs that were struck down by the Supreme Court. He said he's going to keep his specific sector tariffs, known as Section 232 tariffs, in place. And he also said, citing Section 122, that he will impose a 10% global tariff on goods, worldwide. These are tariffs that he argues are more legally sound. They're confirmed. He says the courts have already ruled that he can legally impose these, but they all have their own sets of restrictions, whether it comes to percentage or the time that these tariffs can be in place. So while the president argues that they're just as powerful as the tariffs that were struck down by the Supreme Court this morning, the details of the tariffs he's citing tell a different story.
And what does this ruling mean for the use of presidential powers?
Yeah, the court said that the president exceeded his authority by invoking what's known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to justify the sweeping tariffs that he's had in place since about last spring. Chief Justice Roberts noted that while the president, quote, has the extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, and scope, Congress did not lay out the language that justifies his use of that emergency act for the tariffs that he imposed last year and kind of throughout since then. Trump has argued that the ruling has only clarified his powers, says that the other measures are stronger than the IEEPA. Take a listen to what he said in the White House earlier this afternoon.
Can't charge $1 to any country under IEEPA. Not $1. I assume to protect other countries. This must have been done to protect those other countries, certainly not the United States of America, which they should be interested in protecting. That's what they're supposed to be protecting. But I am allowed to cut off any and all trade or business with that same country. In other words, I can destroy the trade. I can destroy the country. I'm even allowed to impose a foreign country-destroying embargo. I can embargo. I can do anything I want, but I can't charge $1.
Now, the president there is referring to power he has to cut off trade entirely with a country or embargoes he can place, but some of those require consultations with other foreign governments. There are just longer processes for those kind of more drastic measures that he was mentioning and referring to compared to kind of the off-the-hip way he was imposing tariffs in the first year or so of his second term.
All right, Aaron Navarro outside the White House for us today. Thank you so much. Now let's bring in CBS News contributor Rebecca Roiphe. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us on CBS News 24/7. We know Trump has promised to impose a 10% global tariff under a different trade authority. It's called Section 122. Can you explain that provision, and does the president need congressional approval to impose that particular tariff?
Yeah, so this new statute has significantly greater limitations in that the tariff has to be temporary. After 150 days, he would have to get congressional approval for this particular tariff, and it can't exceed 15%. And so he may have a better legal argument under this statute, but there are still limitations that make it such that he can't exactly do what he was doing previously.
Now, we know American importers, they have paid tens of billions of dollars in customs duties because of the president's tariffs. The Supreme Court didn't address the issue of potential refunds for those importers in its ruling, but here's what the president had to say about it.
They take months and months to write an opinion, and they don't even discuss that point. We've taken in hundreds of billions of dollars, not millions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so I said, well, what happens to all the money that we took in? It wasn't discussed. Wouldn't you think they would have put one sentence in there saying that keep the money or don't keep the money, right? I guess it has to get litigated for the next 2 years.
Okay, Rebecca, as you heard there, the president says the president, I should say, was not specific about whether businesses will get refunds. He says it's going to have to play out for years. What do you think here? What can we expect to happen after this ruling?
Yeah, so courts are limited in what they can decide. They have to decide the cases before them, and because the question of refunds wasn't before the Supreme Court, it makes sense that they didn't decide that question. And what will happen, he's absolutely right, is the question will ultimately be litigated. But there are administrative remedies for any business that believes that it was unfairly or illegally taxed under this law. So it simply has to file a claim with Customs and Border Protection. And if that claim is approved, it will get refunded. And then if it's not approved, it can go to court and challenge that refusal, and of course could appeal that challenge up to the Supreme Court. One thing that I think is also important to note, though, is that those companies may well have passed this cost on to consumers, to middle class people, who then will, of course, not have a remedy because they can't go and say that they were taxed. They merely paid for those tax through pass-ons that those big corporations did. So essentially, even if they are refunded, the middle class who really paid the cost of this are not going to be refunded in any way.
Yeah, very, very good point there. Rebecca Roiphe, thank you so much for your time today.
Welcome.
Let's turn to Wall Street as investors unpack what the Supreme Court's ruling could mean for the U.S. economy. The closing bell just rang minutes ago. The Dow closed up 230 points. But here's a look at the top 500 stocks. This is our interactive heat map brought to you by FinViz. And shares of some major companies that import goods from overseas like Amazon and Home Depot, they ticked higher today. CBS News senior business and technology correspondent Ling breaks down the reaction from small businesses.
This decision from the Supreme Court is a major blow to President Trump's economic agenda in his second term. And we're now starting to hear from small businesses across the country who have really been hit hard by these tariffs. So many of them have had to do layoffs and reduce their inventory, raise prices over the past year since that so-called Liberation Day. And two small businesses of Simplified and Busy Baby Matt, both of those founders telling me today that they are thrilled, they're relieved that this decision gives them some clarity. Now, as to whether or not they can get a refund on all of those tariffs that they've already paid is a big question of when and how, and there's discussion of potentially legal action to go after those refunds that they believe are due to them. Now, in terms of how this has impacted the consumer, according to the Yale Budget Lab, the average household has lost about $1,700 in real income because of tariffs. So as for prices, when you might see them come down on imported goods, experts say, groceries, vegetables, fruits might drop in price faster than some of your more longer lead time items like electronics, apparel, shoes, and things like that. So the question about prices is we've seen a jump in prices. We've seen inflation relatively sticky, in part due to these tariffs. The question now is whether or not we will see those prices fall and how that may impact your budget as you figure out, what the rest of the year looks like. But certainly small businesses this morning are celebrating, but they are also cautiously optimistic about what's to come. Back to you guys.